What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Takeaways edition of the Vegas Nation podcast. I'm your host, Heidi Fang. Today, joined by PFF's Brad Spielberger. Really excited to have him on. We're going to talk a lot about some future projections for the Raiders, the AFC West. We're going to break it all down right here. And before we do, just a reminder to hit subscribe wherever you're watching or listening. And also, we are brought to you by Station Casinos, STN Sports. Download that app today. Brad, I'm really happy to bring you on today. Very excited to talk some PFF numbers and some of these predictions and projections that you guys have going on with the upcoming season here, particularly with the Raiders is obviously where my focus will be. But first of all, I wanted to welcome you and thank you for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Let's get into this. So projection-wise, AFC West, I'm seeing a lot, obviously, as a lot of places have been doing with the Raiders coming off a 6-win season. The projection is not high for them to come in and correct that and become a winning team or even a playoff team or anything of that nature. Where would you say right now the overall kind of consensus projection is for the Raiders?
Yeah, so PFF does a strength, projection model and builds out our evaluations of each team, folding in the draft and free agency, looking at strength of schedule and all those various components. And they have a 7-win total projection per our numbers. So kind of right in that wheelhouse, like you said. I do think that they probably have one of the bigger variances in the NFL. Look, if Josh McDaniels feels much more comfortable with Jimmy Garoppolo than he did with Derek Carr, and they feel more bullish about some pieces they've added this offseason, maybe getting some growth from a guy like a Chandler Jones, I guess I should say bounce back, not growth. But, if things go in their way, then maybe they can, beat that number.
I was looking a little bit about some of the write-ups on Tyree Wilson, how the projections have gone for him, that he still seems to need some development, was what one of your colleagues wrote, excuse me. So I wanted to get your take on what Tyree Wilson can bring to this team, and if you have any projections on maybe a sack total from him, because I have seen that you did some sack projections with Will Anderson Jr., so I'm wondering if you had one for Tyree Wilson as well.
Yeah, so I would agree that he needs some technical refinement. The thing with him is he's such a phenomenal athlete, both from a size and length combination, but also his testing and all those numbers that he didn't do officially at the combine. But apparently, behind closed doors, when they do a lot of these testing, is a really, really good athlete. So I also think with him, like I said, if you do get a better Chandler Jones, and you, of course, have Max Crosby, who, for us is one of the best edge rushers in the entire NFL, you get a lot of distraction with them and offenses, chipping on them and double teaming them. And that frees up Tyree Wilson to rush from the outside, maybe a little bit from the inside as well. I could see him getting 5 or 6 sacks in his rookie season, which might sound low, but is a pretty good total for a rookie.
Especially because, like you mentioned, Chandler Jones, I still think there's an expectation that there'll be a lot of rotation and, like you were mentioning, for development time to be given to Tyree Wilson before he comes in and goes full in on that position for the Raiders. On the flip side, they also drafted a tight end pretty high, who was kind of projected, I think, by some people to go up in the first round. But you have Michael Mayer coming to the Raiders in the second round. He had a very high college number from PFF. I wanted to get just kind of a breakdown on this number. I believe it was 92.5 from college. How do you arrive at that number for a player's type of caliber and what that number stands for when you look at a 92.5 projection, Michael Mayer as his PFF grade?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. On the flip side of Tyree Wilson, Meyer is incredibly productive, one of the best tight ends we've ever graded at the college level, but kind of didn't test particularly well, and I think that's why he fell outside of the first round because of some of that athletic testing. But nevertheless, I think the main reason why he's that high in the 92.5 range is because we had one tight end in the entire country last year that had a receiving grade of above 90 and a blocking grade above 80, and that is Michael Mayer. So how that number gets derived is we grade every single snap. You get either plus a half, plus 1, plus 1.5, or plus 2, and of course the negative flip side of those numbers. And then using every single snap grade, we then map it to a 0 to 100 projection. So he's a very, very good and very consistently good player on a snap-by-snap basis.
Great. And so as you start to grade him for the NFL, how much does blocking and catching and receiving, all the different things, drops. How does that kind of come into a grade for somebody that's starting from scratch in the NFL?
Yeah, so they are weighted differently, based on the component that we believe is going to, more likely impact the outcome of a football game. Blocking is very, very important, especially for a tight end.
Yeah.
But if he has a phenomenal receiving grade and is the productive player that he was in college, that is going to carry a lot of that number. We actually do have a drop grade. You also obviously just chart drops, and was it a bad throw or was it on the receiver for not bringing in the football? But yeah, he starts from scratch, starts from square one, and it's the same process. Just every single snap gets graded, and then that gets mapped out to a full number. I think he's a very high floor. Maybe some
Yeah.
teams thought his ceiling wasn't super high, but tight end is a very difficult position to be good at right away in the NFL. There's a learning curve, and he's super young too. But I still think he might be able to be productive pretty early on in his NFL career.
The AFC West obviously has a ton of quarterbacks and wide receivers. We also mentioned tight ends, so Travis Kelce, is there. There's a lot of offense to be had in the AFC West. And when you look at the defensive side of the ball, the Raiders, have kind of done some work in the draft and the offseason to try to help that. One of the names that I was most interested in is Duke Shelley, because he was rated pretty high on the cornerbacks for the Raiders when I looked down the projected starting 11 for the team. And he had a very high PFF grade. So what is the anticipation for the Raiders kind of secondary and where you see the cornerbacks that they have falling into place in this Shark Tank offense type of division?
Yeah, no, it is interesting. Shelley is an undersized guy, excuse me, but we've always felt was a better player on the outside, dating back to Kansas State in college. So it's going to be interesting who ends up playing in the slot, who ends up playing on the outside. I also think he's interesting because the teams he's been on thus far are heavy, heavy zone teams. And Patrick Graham, when he has the personnel, historically has tended to try to play a little bit more man coverage. So they added him, they added David Long from the Rams, also a very heavy zone coverage team. But yeah, look, Shelley is a scrapper, right? He wants to battle with you. He's going to make plays at the catch point, even though he is 5'9", 5'10". He's a good, productive player that, I think has always been overlooked because of his size. But whenever he gets an opportunity, he plays some good football.
So the Raiders sitting at 7 right now. If you had to, because I've seen you put out some betting numbers as well in one of your more recent articles that's up on PFF.com. I wanted to get, maybe if you know them, the money line kind of look at the over under right now for the Raiders. Is it also sitting at 7 as kind of projected by your team?
Yeah, so I think it's 7.5 is the Raiders' season
Okay.
win total over under. Obviously, it varies book by book,
Right.
but I think that is where the line sits right now. Look, and you mentioned obviously it's a good division in the AFC West, also a loaded conference in just the AFC in general. So it's going to be, there are probably going to be AFC teams that win 7 games that might be better than an NFC team that wins 10 games, just based on who they're playing against. But I do believe in the pure data projection of right around 7. But I do think, like I said, I genuinely believe that maybe there is a tail outcome where they overperform compared to a lot of expectations because of just a comfort level between the quarterback and the head coach, which obviously matters a great deal.
Okay, and that comfortability, you kind of mentioned Jimmy Garoppolo earlier. How much do you think that between the years that have passed from Jimmy working with Josh McDaniels, that it's kind of like getting back on a bike and just figuring it out all over again, and that it would come fairly easily?
I think so. I think the language, they obviously speak the same language, so
Yeah.
all that is easier to do. I'm sure Derek Carr had to learn a whole lot of new terminology
Yeah.
with McDaniels in place. So I think that goes a long way by itself. And yeah, they've been apart for a couple of years now, but particularly when you're working with Garoppolo, when you're bringing him into the NFL, which McDaniels obviously helped him do, I'm sure they're extremely comfortable with each other. They can kind of maybe be faster at the line, be faster with checks and adjustments and things like that. I'm sure the comfort level is a big reason why he is a Las Vegas Raider.
Do you agree with the 7 number for the Raiders as just looking outside in at what you think the team has to offer?
I do. I think the interesting thing will be, can this defense get up to speed and kind of play above their talent level? Frankly, it's not a particularly on paper a great unit, but maybe if you generate enough pressure up front, like I said, Chandler Jones was not very good last year, but you paid him a lot of money for a reason, and he was a very good player in Arizona for a very long time. So for all we know, maybe he was working through a minor injury or things were going on that were not really in the public light. If he can play like the guy we saw in Arizona for 5-6 years, it could dramatically change how this defense operates. But yeah, I do think they're kind of right in that 7 to 9 win range, in 2023.
Lastly, if you could give me your projections for how the AFC would look going from the Super Bowl defending champion Chiefs on down.
Yeah. So the AFC West or the whole conference?
The AFC West.
Yeah, so I'm going to get the Chiefs right back in the saddle. Really didn't lose a whole lot of talent. Added some good players, I thought, in the draft class. Their first round edge rusher Felix Anudike-Uzomah from Kansas State was a player I liked a lot. So I think they're still the class of the division. I think it's kind of hard to argue with that right now. I think the Chargers made some important moves. I am concerned for them long term a little bit with some of the older players on their roster, but for now, Keenan Allen and Khalil Mack and a lot of these guys are coming back for at least one more year, and I think they're going to be very aggressive in how they try to win some football games. And then I think it's a battle between Denver and Las Vegas for that third spot. I could see it go either way. I think Sean Payton's a phenomenal coach. I lived in New Orleans for 5 years, so I saw him coach the Saints firsthand, but they had a lot of issues last year, and they did add some players in free agency, but there still are some personnel holes in that roster. I think it'll be, either way with third and fourth place. But I do think, unfortunately, Kansas City and the Chargers are a little bit ahead of the other two teams.
I lied when I said last question because you mentioned the conference. So I was wondering if you would had like a favorite right now that you think is going to take home the big enchilada in the AFC.
Yeah, look, it's hard. It's hard not to go with the chalk and take the Kansas City Chiefs again. But I do think the Cincinnati Bengals had a really strong offseason. They've had a few the last couple of years in a row. Didn't lose a ton of talent, a little bit on defense, but I think they could maybe finally take that step and win the conference outright.
I love having you guys from PFF on. I love breaking down some of these numbers, kind of giving the fans as well an idea of what goes behind those was great. I really appreciate your time today. Brad Spielberger, you can find him at PFF_Brad on Twitter. Is there anything that you have coming up that you'd like to let the fans know about, mention some project or what have you, or something that you're writing?
Definitely. So I'm starting to look at extensions, early extensions for players entering contract years. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure that applies to many Raiders right now, but if you want to get a gauge for the market for some of the, the best young players coming up for new contracts, we'll do some trade predictions as well. Is Hunter Renfrow maybe a guy that's on the block right now? We'll explore that a little bit as well. So any transaction that's happening from now until week 1, we'll be covering.
Is there any tease you could give me there, aside from mentioning Hunter Renfrow's name? They did draft a lot of slot receivers, right? It has that look about it right now. I think some people are projecting Devontae Adams, Jacoby Myers, and then Renfrow in the slot. But with what they did with the offseason, there's now, I think, 11 wide receivers on the roster for the Raiders going into the offseason program. How likely do you think it is? There's been that kind of smoke, that talk around it. And sometimes where there's smoke, we know, what can happen with a potential trade. What did you have in mind with Hunter? Or do we have to wait for the article?
No. I think the smoke is probably real. It's been around for a couple months now. Even before it kind of hit the public light, it was something a lot of people were chatting about. Jacoby Myers can play on the outside, but has played about 2/3 of his snaps in the slot throughout his career. Trey Tucker, you mentioned, the third-round pick, is probably a slot type of player going forward. So, we'll get into the details of what the value could be and stuff like that. But he'll be on the short list. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I think it is possible.
Well, thank you again for that. Appreciate your time very much. And for everybody out there, check out PFF.com for all of those numbers, ratings, projections, and things like of that nature. And for all things Raiders, check us out at VegasNation.com. For Brad Spielberger, I'm Heidi Fang. Thank you so much for checking out the show today. All right, joining me now here on the Vegas Nation Takeaways podcast, Paul Gutierrez. I see him all the time in the media room. We got all kinds of La Bamba jokes, but today we're talking Tom Brady and taking a minority ownership into the Raiders, at least agreed upon terms for that still has to go through a process. Before we get into that process, though, Paul, I wanted to get your take on this because you were involved in breaking the story and really getting to the nuts and bolts of it. What really began this relationship between Mark Davis and Tom Brady? Like, how far back does it go to getting him to this point where they were able to agree to these terms?
Yeah, it's interesting, Heidi. It goes back, obviously, at least publicly that we know of, to 2020 and during COVID and during that off season, because the Raiders were more than interested in bringing Tom Brady in as a player at that point in time, and they got fairly deep into conversations. It would have been a fresh start for the organization coming to Las Vegas and having a new quarterback, and that would have meant having to move on from Derek Carr at that point. But it was all kind of scuttled at the last moment by then coach John Gruden, who really, really liked what he had going on with Derek Carr at that time. So you take that's 3 years in the past now. Now you fast forward a little bit, and then all of a sudden, Tom Brady's the one that drops that he's buying into the WNBA champion Las Vegas Aces, which are
Right.
also, oh yeah, owned by Mark Davis. So that gets it going. And then it had been about a month or so since the rumors had started that he was looking into getting into the Raiders, and that actually was broken by Seth Wickersham and Adam Schefter, colleagues of mine at ESPN, that they were in deep, deep discussions about this happening. And then yesterday, it was broken again by another outlet that it was getting real close to happening. I called Mark Davis, and he gave me the quote that yeah, they had actually come to an agreement, and it's pending approval by the NFL owners that they'll allow him to come in to be a partner, depending upon how much he invests, and it'll obviously be a minority share into the organization,
Right.
and not have a lot of decision making power. But you bring that kind of star power into this organization again in Las Vegas. It's one of those things where it kind of makes all the sense in the world. But then when you look at it from a pure football standpoint and the football fan standpoint, it kind of makes people kind of recoil a little bit, especially the old school Raider fans.
Right. That's something I wanted to
Yeah,
discuss with you as well, because like we all know the fumble wasn't fumble, it was in your article
yeah,
about that
it
particular
was a fumble.
question. He didn't answer the question, right?
No, not this
Right.
time.
So fans are concerned, like, how much will Brady come in to kind of tinker with things, to maybe even insert himself at some point in the season? Should they be? I saw a tweet that said 3-6, Raiders have Tom Brady coming down, swooping in to take over at the helm, especially with the rule approved yesterday that they can carry three quarterbacks on a roster. So people were like kind of making these jokes and insinuating that perhaps they think Tom Brady could even work his way onto the roster. I don't think it works that way, but how can you help Raider fans kind of settle those nerves and those questions?
Yeah, and I guess I'll put it to people this way too. And I know Las Vegas is a transient city, so a lot of people are from somewhere else that don't really have that connection, the long-term connection with Las Vegas athletics in general. But if you've been in Vegas for a long time and you are a huge UNLV basketball fan going back 30, 40 years ago, this is akin to Steve Alford coming in and being the
Okay.
running rebel coach with Mike Krzyzewski as the athletic director. Indiana and Duke, you're talking about the last two times that the Rebels lost in the Final Four in 1987 and 1991. Those are painful memories to them. You transpose that to the NFL and the Tuck Rule game and the Patriots. That game launched Tom Brady and the Patriots into the dynasty that they became, and it kind of hastened the Raiders' decline. Yeah, they did go to the Super Bowl the next year, but they haven't won a playoff game since. So does that mean now that Tom Brady at 45 years old is going to come in and swoop in and take over if Jimmy Garoppolo gets hurt? Which again, we know they brought in Garoppolo to be the starter, but he's had a hard time staying on the field over the course, especially the last 2 or 3 years with injuries. It's just not. It's not really written that way, so to speak. It was kind of going that way when he was interested in buying into the Dolphins a couple of years ago, but he was still under contract to Tampa Bay. Now he's retired. Now he's just kind of enjoying life. I don't see him having much say in terms of the football side of things. Now, the difference here is that he has a very, very, very good relationship with the GM, Dave Ziegler, and probably an even better relationship with Josh McDaniels. So could
Yeah.
you see him out there in practice, kind of spinning some spirals and throwing the ball around and just hanging out? Probably. Now, is he going to, impart his wisdom? I don't know. I don't see that happening either. But it does nothing to dispel the myth of Patriots West, right? Which got Mark Davis a little upset when we mentioned it to him at the owners' meetings back in March. So it's going to be, it's going to take a lot for fans, hardcore Raider fans, to see that and be okay. Again, think of the late 80s, early 90s. Franco Harris all of a sudden is now roaming the sidelines with the Raiders, the Immaculate Reception. It's of that ilk. And yet it's something that with the star power he's going to bring, it's going to be able to help the organization. I mean, it's Vegas. It's the entertainment capital of the world.
Now, as we know, I believe Brady was set for a broadcasting deal with Fox. How does this
And he still
affect
is.
that? Excuse me?
Not at all. Yeah, not at all.
Yeah.
It won't affect it at all. I mean, now unless he decides to try to play, he's got the contract, and Fox, according to our reporting with Seth Wickersham and Adam Schefter, Fox has given its blessing. And as long as he doesn't have above a certain percentage of decision making power at the network or with the team, it's all good. So the key word there was blessing, and that was in a previous report from Wickersham and Schefter. So again, you got all these different irons in the fire, which, if nothing else, it just makes people talk about it, right? And it keeps the team up at the top of the interest level and keeping those social media platforms going.
I got a couple more for you, Paul. Just first, yesterday, this is off the Tom Brady topic, but at the owners' meetings, the NFL approved flex scheduling for Thursday night football. The Raiders have a game against the Chargers, and that taking place in week 15. So this whole flexing scheduling can happen between weeks 13 to 17. Mark Davis was a dissenting vote in that and did not want it. Their players can, teams can get up to 28 days notice before the game is flexed. How do you think this kind of affects things for the team from a positive and negative standpoint?
I don't know what the positive. I guess if you have a month's head start, okay, but the NFL schedule release is kind of a national holiday anymore, right? I mean, fans book family vacations around where their team is going to be. And Mark Davis did tell, I believe it was USA Today at the owners' meetings when it came out, that he didn't like it. He was one of the 8 dissenting votes, but he didn't like it from the fan perspective, because what if all these Raider fans, and Vegas being a destination city, were choosing to come that Thursday night to watch the Raiders and spend the rest of their weekend or whatever they're going to do. And then he said, and all 3 Charger fans decided that they were going to go too. He took a shot at the Chargers. It affects people's plans and vacations, and everything is set up around that. So I get that. From a player perspective, I don't know how fair it would be, or if it's even likely, for a team to get flexed into a Thursday game when you've already perhaps done it earlier in the year. Teams can now play more than one Thursday night game a year. That was always one of the things, was, look, you can only do it once a year, and that's good. Well, now how much of a hit on the body, literally and figuratively, is it going to take if you're playing on short weeks multiple times a year?
Yeah, definitely so. And again, Mark Davis, a dissenting vote in that process, but it did pass. So that is something that can happen coming up. The only game involved with the Raiders is in week 15. And lastly, you mentioned, this town becoming the sports mecca. You were a part of Vegas, like you mentioned UNLV back in the day, and you were with the Review Journal. You've been through all of these different phases of this city. And so when I look at Tom Brady coming in here, the superstar power, Marky Wahlberg here now doing stuff. I think we have to call him Mark now, not Marky Mark, but
not Marky Mark.
Mark. Yeah. So we have Mark Wahlberg here. There's all these power players now moving into this city, kind of really putting their stake in it. How deep do you think Tom Brady will go with this stake and claims that he's put into the Aces, to the Raiders? How much of a figure will you expect him to be in this city now?
If he's smart and he doesn't want to pay any state income taxes, a lot. He'll make it his home address, right? I mean, that's one of the biggest benefits. I know a lot of Raider employees, when they moved to Las Vegas, they didn't technically get a raise, but they got a raise because they no longer had to pay state income tax. They got a 13% bump in their paycheck.
Yeah.
And that's anybody that moves there, right? From California, especially. So, how big of a piece? I mean, he's there all the time anyway. All you got to do is look at his Instagram page. I mean,
The
the week that
UFC,
you see him all the time.
Yeah.
He's at the UFC. He's at the Wynn. He's doing workouts at the Wynn. He's hawking his supplements at the Wynn.
That's
So
right.
and it goes back, and it's everything that's new is, or what's the saying? Everything that's new is old again, or everything that's old is new again. The Rat Pack. Those guys were the top of their industry, and they made Vegas their home base, so to speak.
Yeah.
So It's very much, if there's money to be made and there's spoils to be had, people will go where it's to be had, and that's Las Vegas at this point in time. It's amazing to me that, and it was 30 years ago when I was in school at UNLV, that it was UNLV men's basketball, and that was pretty much it. Yeah, there was the AAA team; they were the Stars back then, before they were the 51s and now the Aviators. But that was it. UFC wasn't around, and at least not like it is now. The Raiders were in LA at that point before going back to Oakland. The Golden Knights were like a figment of somebody's imagination. It's really amazing to me how it's just kind of come to this point where now even oh yeah, look at this here. I just happen to have this where I can't even
It's
won't
going
focus.
blurry on me.
There it
Oh,
is.
rooted in Oakland, the
Yeah,
A's. Yeah.
those guys might actually show up. So it's really different. And it's something I never thought I would see in my wildest dreams, let alone UNLV basketball kind of being, on the back burner, but all these other pro sports coming. It's like when the NCAA tournament was there in March. Never thought you'd see it. And here it is.
Well, Paul Gutierrez, again, writer for ESPN, the Raiders writer for their NFL coverage in Las Vegas. Paul, thank you so much for all that you did today, coming in, breaking that story. Really appreciate having you. It's P. Gutierrez, right? On Twitter?
It is. And
P.
I'm wondering,
Gutierrez, ESPN. Sorry.
P. Gutierrez, ESPN. And Heidi, I hope you won that art contest in Brian Buzzard and Woody Woodpecker.
It was in art lessons. But thank you for coming on again. And I'll definitely see you probably sometime in the very near future as the Raiders offseason program gets underway.
Talk to you then.
Thanks.